Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are in the Johnson edition. We turn now to poem 567, He Gave Away His Life. So much, of course, of this poem is going to be contingent on the antecedent to the pronoun he. We're going to come back to this very same idea here in a few poems when we hit 573. Another Christ poem, if you wish to call it that. Emily is theologian. She is going to use the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross as a metaphor for what it means to live with pain and suffering in one's life. Now, our assumptions that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily is our playlist. Hopefully you worked through our set of introductory comments as well as the preceding 566 poems. We just finished with 566, A Dying Tiger. Now, if you have done that reading, you know that we've already been playing this game. Emily, the great poet of suffering, the great poet of woe, the great poet of pain, and the value of pain. We might even say it this way: pain is a propedeutic. It's instructional in some way for Emily. Now, I want you to study in this poem her verbs, because it's quite remarkable. So every time we come to a verb, I recommend that you circle it, okay? Also, let's talk about perspective, and more particularly the disciples of Jesus Christ from the reading of this poem. Let's enjoy. He gave away his life to us, gigantic sum, a trifle in his own esteem, but magnified by fame, until it burst the hearts that fancy they could hold, when swift it slipped its limit and on the heavens unrolled. 'Tis ours to wince and weep and wonder and decay by blossom's gradual process. He chose maturity and quickening, as we sowed just obviated bud. And when we turned to note the growth, broke perfect from the pod. Now, some have said that the best word of this poem is the word perfect, and in many ways it does kind of work, especially as a theological read. Notice we'll begin with the Ephesians 5:25-27 reference from your Bible and from your reading of biblical text. Of course, you'll remember there that St. Paul argues that Christ gave himself for the church. So notice here right away, he gave away his life. The idea of sacrifice is obviously implicit here as well. But then notice, there's two different ways to read the first two lines. Again, this is genius, Emily. One way to read this is, he gave away his life to us. But notice, really, you're supposed to pause at the end of the first line. He gave away his life. And now all of a sudden, to us, gigantic sum. Now, who is the us? Well, many have read this as the disciples of Christ immediately. Some have argued the followers of Christ post-crucifixion. To us, notice, gigantic sum. In other words, giving away one's life is a gigantic sum. A trifle, notice, in his own esteem, but magnified by faith. In other words, let's point out how Emily loves to do this, these comparisons. In other words, in his mind, giving away his life was not that big of a deal. It was a trifle. Obviously, to those of us, that is to say, if the us here is his disciples, those who are immediately his followers, it was he calls it, the speaker calls it, a gigantic sum. But notice what made Christ's death significant. Now again, guys, this is very subtle stuff, because some will read this as Emily's celebration of Christian theology. Others will read this as very subtly blasphemous. Do you notice what she says makes Christ's death on the cross so important? Because he got famous. In other words, that's how anybody knows about Christ, is that he went through the process of dying on the cross. Fame. Until the fame, it burst the hearts that fancied they could hold, when swift it slipped. Again, notice all these verbs here. When swift it slipped its limit, and on the heavens unrolled. Go back to poem 328, you'll remember the bird unrolls his feathers. It's the only time she ever uses this unrolled like this. In other words, it's only after Christ's death that we begin to recognize the value of Christ's death. 'Tis ours, back to the plural here, the followers, the disciples, and then see your W's here. To wince and weep and wonder, go back to 561 with her use of the word wonder, and decay. Now I think this may be the key word of the poem. As we've said so many times, Emily's poems often hang on one word. And I think the word decay is significant. In other words, the longer and longer we live after the crucifixion of Christ, the less and less the fame accorded to that, she seems to suggest. There's a decaying that happens by blossoms, and then she'll use this amazing metaphor. Gradual process, he chose maturity. In other words, the argument B, by the way, let's point out, she never actually says that the he of this poem is Christ. Can you see this? She never actually says that. We can read it as that, and obviously it makes sense, but she could be talking about any martyr, anyone who sacrifices their life, and the culmination of that life was what? What was the maturity of that life? To die. And quickening, as we sowed, this is again maybe the original disciples, right, of Christ, just obviated bud. In other words, it was just about to bloom. And when we turn, notice the we here capitalized, to note the growth, broke, perfect, from the pod. Many have said that her use of the word pod here has to be, of course, the church itself. So at 2a, how are we going to deal with a poem like this? I think her argument is that salvation requires sacrifice, whatever that is, whether we're talking Christ or a martyr or whatever. At 2b, well, notice the verbs. They are dynamic here. And of course, the voice of the disciples that are speaking. At 3a, we mentioned the biblical passage of Ephesians 5, 25 to 27. By the way, we can think about our Milton here. Yes, Paradise Lost tells about the Garden of Eden motif, but it is Paradise Regained. By the way, we've given full lectures at learnstrong.net. It's Paradise Regained that tells the story, of course, of Christ's temptations and the Christ story. Finally, at 3b, when was a time in your own life to own a poem like this? When was a time for you when sacrifice was necessary to get the thing you wanted? You had to have a little bit of pain. Thank you.